Ratchet and Clank is one of my favorite franchises. These mascots were there for me every Christmas morning of every year. They released until 2010, and after that I was in college and bought the games on release. I've beaten all but one of the mainline games and the first PSP game. I'm a really big fan of the earlier games, but I also like the PS3 games, albeit in their own way. By that I mean, the series has definitely taken a shift. Earlier games were more focused on platforming. Even the shooting sections were more platforming focused, as the lack of being able to strafe or aim like a traditional third-person shooter forced you to use running and jumping into the right position to compensate. As the series went on, more and more traditional shooter elements made their way into the series, removing that emphasis on platforming in favor of shooting. It's not inherently bad, but it's definitely different. I think the best illustration of that difference is in the reboot of the first game compared to the original. For reference, the reboot is the worst one I've played, and also the only one I haven't beaten. The only thing more mindless than the shooting was the jokes, and the only thing bland than the story was our main characters. Gone was the satire of consumerism and capitalist greed in favor of whimsical space adventure fantasy, and the only inspiration in it stronger than Star Wars was an amalgamation of other properties also inspired by Star Wars, with a dash of flash gordon for good measure. It's like an animal version of Buzz Lightyear with more traditional third-person shooter controls. This has been the direction the series has been going in for a while, but it was never that way to start off. The reboot going in this direction was a clear sign that Insomniac put all of their eggs into this whimsical space shooter basket. Now, I thought that the PS3 games did a good job with this version of Ratchet, but with the reboot disappointing me so much, I have to ask, what if this formula has run this series into the ground? Well, let's find out. On the story front, the complaints I had about the reboot are still there, but they aren't nearly as bad this time around. In fact, there's a lot more charm, and it's close to the quality of the PS3 games than the reboot. A lot of this comes from the fact that the reboot Ratchet is no longer canon, as this new game is set after the last PS3 game, Into the Nexus. That being said, reboot Ratchet and PS3 Ratchet are basically the same character, just that the PS3 Ratchet slowly became heroic, whereas reboot Ratchet was born that way. So if you've only played the reboot, you'll recognize this Ratchet even if you don't recognize some of the references surrounding him. The game is that whimsical space Ratchet, but it's fun. The story, though, is kind of eh. The dialogue isn't awful, but it's not anything you'll remember, which is particularly a shame because Nefarious is in this. Nefarious was the best part of the third game, Up Your Arsenal, tied with its arena mode. His screaming, insecure rants were wonderfully acted and animated by themselves, but for me the thing that really pulled it together was how Nefarious played off of the serene, dignified butler Lawrence, who knew exactly how stupid his boss was, but wasn't able to call him out on it, at least directly. It was like a sadder, more slapstick version of the dynamic Ratchet and Clank had in the first game, with a side of the consumerist and capitalist greed sort of critique that the series was known for, and it worked. In A Crack in Time, this dynamic wasn't quite built on in any way, and was considerably less funny in my opinion, but Nefarious and Lawrence were still memorable as returning villains. Then the reboot came, and Lawrence was gone. Nefarious was a lone scientist, and the straight man he played off of was arguably our main character, someone who could talk back at him, so that awkward dynamic of the boss being dumber than the subordinate was gone. For kids who have only played the reboot, A Rift in Time is only his second appearance, and what little depth there was to Nefarious hasn't been taken away from them, because they never had it. But for longtime fans of the franchise, not only is this yet another appearance of Nefarious without Lawrence, this is the third or even fourth time he's come back in the series overall. And the shtick is getting old. Even if Nefarious is still new to you, his shtick isn't really used effectively here until arguably the very end of the game, which I can't really get into without spoiling it. Here's what I will say though. The dynamic Nefarious has at the end of the game, if it was there from the start, would have made for a far more interesting and far funnier experience overall, and if they even bring Nefarious back at all, I really hope it's with this dynamic. Overall, the story isn't the worst, but it's not great either. There are some nice moments here and there, but there's nothing super emotionally gripping. And that unfortunately includes the new character, Rivet. I was actually really excited about the inclusion of Rivet, because to be honest, Ratchet and Clank are fun, but they don't really have anywhere to go character-wise. I feel like both of these characters have run out of character arcs that would be appropriate for this style of game. Rivet is someone entirely new, so she was an ample opportunity to create a character with real flaws to overcome in their quest to become a hero. But instead, she's basically another Ratchet, and most of her differences come from her prosthetic arm and her voice actor. She has charm, but not much else, which I can unfortunately say for the rest of the game. I'm not saying there's nothing to this game, There are some attempts at character arcs, and the final story pieces of these arcs are pretty good, but the game goes too long between developments for those arcs to feel anything but tacked on. For me, this is a storytelling epidemic nowadays, where the beginning of an arc and the ending of an arc are good, but the middle doesn't do enough to build it up, if it does anything at all. And for a lot of people, this works. The ending is so memorable that they'll post the 2-minute clip of the arc's resolution on Twitter with the caption, "How can you not like this?" Forgetting that 80% of the adventure in the middle is just unrelated exposition and set pieces. But for the rest of us who do remember that 80%, for those of us who feel that an arc should be more than just 5 minutes at the beginning and 5 minutes at the end, it can feel a bit tacked on and forced. It feels like they needed the story to be about something, so let's just throw in what looks like an arc in there and, hopefully it'll string people along long enough to be at the end of the game. I also can't shake the fact that, thematically speaking, it kind of stumbles a bit when compared to the older titles. I'm not saying the satire of the older games was super in-depth, but it was funny. The newer games remove that entirely, and this absence especially is felt when you're in the game's early cyberpunk level that's been demoed in the trailers. A cyberpunk level has so much potential for older Ratchet and Clank's type of humor, but in the new game, it's basically just an aesthetic used to represent the bad guys winning and to be vaguely ominous. Instead of satire, we replace it with riffing off of pop culture and fantasy icons like pirates, superheroes, and bodybuilders, the latter of which ended up being the best shtick in a mediocre lot. Ratchet and Clank admittedly do pop culture riffing better than most titles, like there's definitely a unique voice in this game, but it's not as distinct or as funny as the one it's replacing. The best way I can describe the tone of this game is nice. Like that's the thematic through line of this game. Nice. Anytime a character has an internal conflict, someone immediately reassures them that no, actually, you're a good person. Sometimes that someone is themselves mid-conversation with themselves. The moments of weakness seem less like something to be paid off in an arc, and more like little nuggets of wisdom for an assumed 4-year-old that'll be playing the game. I'm not even saying that as like a criticism, I'm just saying it as like a thing in the game. I know that the furry vengeance space adventure isn't for adults, shouldn't be a surprise, but like, I don't know. The original Ratchet and Clank was for all ages, but it was targeted at young teens specifically, with some stuff for adults thrown in. Now the series has clearly shifted to something far more focused on younger kids, with some references to previous games thrown in for the longtime fans. Cynically, this is Insomniac's target audience, children and older fans my age that are now raising said children. But I mean, what about people like me, adults who've replaced having children with playing video games for 8 hours straight? What then, Insomniac? Okay, but seriously, this is probably the source of all my complaints. Past Ratchets were made for, I'd say, like 8-year-olds and up, primarily targeted at 12-year-olds, but enjoyable enough for young adults too. New Ratchet is shifted to be like 5 and older, with some stuff for their moms and dads. And on that front, the story is, well, it's still kind of mediocre, but it's not a failure by any means. The worst part of the story, for me, is probably just feeling bummed that I'm not the target audience for the game anymore. Thankfully, the gameplay is extended an olive branch. The game is definitely still a third-person shooter, but it's some of the best third-person shooting the series has offered so far. It fixes a ton of presentation and gameplay issues that I had with the reboot. First off, no more are you locked to 30 FPS. Ratchet and Clank are back in 60 FPS, and the performance option with ray tracing still results in a beautiful image, even at the 1080p I played the game on. You can change visual options, such as removing motion blur, the beer goggles of gaming. You can remap controls. I also liked how the game has more than 3 difficulty modes, something I haven't seen since the 4th game, Deadlocked, and I'm very thankful for that. It still doesn't match Deadlock's sheer number of enemies and mayhem, but on hard mode, it's the closest the series has been yet. It can certainly feel like it's there when you have enough particles and helper robots flying around in the battlefield. If you're someone who plays a lot of shooters, this game can offer a tense shooting experience, at least if you try to upgrade all the guns instead of only using the best ones and calling it a day. Another big problem in the reboot that was fixed and ripped apart was that in the reboot, enemies don't react to your shots. Go back and play it if you don't believe me. The enemies have death animations, but the shots that don't kill them rarely elicit a real reaction. In Ripped Apart, however, nearly every enemy reacts to being shot, and this isn't like a nitpick. How your enemies react to being shot is, for people like me, half of the formula in determining how fun it is to shoot somebody. Watching someone react to your bullets and make them feel that much more powerful. These reactions not only add a ton of visceral feedback to the game, but it also adds gameplay depth. Your shots can stun enemies as well depending on the gun and where you hit them. There's also an RPG mode you can toggle in the options that displays damage numbers, which again not only offers more visceral feedback, but lets you easily compare the damages of different weapons. These are all really welcome changes in Insomniac. Please keep these options moving forward in Ratchet and Clank, if not every shooter you make. My only complaint is that there's no longer an option to shoot without aiming. By that I mean, there's no longer any of that free moving gameplay like in the older games. You're essentially in lock strafe mode at all times now, and whenever you fire your gun, it immediately aims you to where your reticle is and fires. I do miss being able to run around and fire without being in lock strafe mode like in the older games. This is something even the more shooter heavy PS3 games had. It actually has tactical use as well, as moving your character is faster than shifting your reticle, and also it's a lot of fun. I guess now that the L2 button, which before was the lock strafe button, is now instead mapped to zooming in, they just put you in lock strafe mode all the time, but with the PS5's adaptable triggers, it could work control-wise. Half the press of the L2 puts you in strafe mode, full press zooms you in. I don't know, just a thought. I think that it'd make for a better controlling game, or at least a good optional control scheme for longtime fans. Overall though, really good stuff. The presentation is by far the best part of the game, but also the part I can't really put into words beyond saying that this game plays, looks, and sounds really, really good. The visuals, gameplay, controls, the sound design of the guns and collecting bolts, even the music, while not as good as the original games, is far better than the more generic and understated score of the reboot and a lot of the PS3 games. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the level design, or at least the level design was not made for me. It's not bad, and a good chunk of the levels are pretty open with collectibles to grab and places to explore, and the movement is fluid enough that just traversing each level is satisfying in its own way, but it's very easy. Most of the gameplay itself is actually fairly linear despite the open levels, and that linearity is used more for cinematic set pieces than for challenging platforming. The big thing, TM, of this game is that there are rifts to other dimensions everywhere. This, combined with the PS5's beefier hardware, results in some admittedly impressive shifts from one environment to the next, but from a gameplay perspective, it's nothing that hasn't been done before. With minimal spoilers, there are 3 ways that the Rift feature comes into play in the game. One way is in scripted scenes like you've seen in the trailer, where you quickly move from one environment to the next. Now on a technical level, this is insane. I actually can't stress enough how insane it is that Insomniac got the PS5 to load assets this high quality in worlds this vast and open instantaneously. These developers are making literal magic look easy. This required a lot of talent and it should be applauded. But from a gameplay perspective, it's more or less just an instant fast travel to another level. It's a very technically and visually impressive fast travel, one that I'm really looking forward to seeing in games where fast traveling is more of an option, like in Elder Scrolls or other open world games, but in Rift Apart, that's really all it is. You don't use multiple rifts to solve puzzles, at least not really. When you need to go to a new dimension, the game will tell you and it'll be the only option you have. These rifts are not really used to enhance the complexity of the gameplay. The closest of this the game comes is certain collectibles are only in one dimension, but even then it's no different than any other hidden collectible in the series. Overall, it's visual spectacle used in a linear way. Instead of walking through a door, you walk through a portal. The second way the rifts are used is via portals you can pull yourself into, something you see in the gameplay trailers. A feature like this has a ton of potential for depth and complexity, or at least to mix up fights a bit, but it's not really used to its fullest potential, and the reason is, and I can't really avoid talking about this any longer, probably because it would be too difficult for a lot of kids. You can't really have selectable difficulty for a level design, so the level design in this kids game is understandably made for kids. If you look at the original Ratchet and Clank, the platforming in those games weren't super duper complicated either. Ratchet and Clank's platforming came more from the shooting than the actual platforming itself, but the actual platforming gauntlets weren't really that complicated. And now that the game's combat is more or less a shooter, the actual platforming has stayed the same to appeal to kids, younger kids than the original games at that, and the result is a game that feels more like Uncharted than Mario. Going back to our example with the Rift portals, you don't have to like jump around with any kind of clever timing or anything like that. The rifts are more or less like grapple hook points, or they're an emergency eject button if you get yourself cornered in a fight. You can also see this lack of depth with the second way the game uses rifts with the dimensional pockets. These are little platforming challenges off to the side that are basically like warp pipes in Mario or bonus stages in Crash Bandicoot. They're light platforming challenges, but they're actually typically easier than the main content, not harder. And the platforming in the main game is already pretty easy. Again, I get that the level design being adjustable is an unreasonable ask, but part of me also thinks the pocket dimensions are optional areas for costumes. Couldn't these challenges be harder at least? But at the same time, people who aren't good at video games or are new to video games may still want to have extra content off to the side, and it's clear this game is made more for them than it is for people who are expecting more of a challenge. As it stands now, the best way to describe this game's platforming is it often feels like a Sonic game if Sonic was slower. It's a bunch of really easy jumps that lead you into a wall that you automatically run on, that automatically lands you where you need to be to jump up, and it's spectacle, but it's not real platforming. You're not really judged by timing or anything like that. Again, it's only a slight jump above the fully automated platforming of Uncharted, and functionally feels the same. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions tend to still be very easy. Even the vehicle parts are about as linear as a Call of Duty game, rather than the more open vehicle sections of, say, the Jak and Daxter series. And I don't think that this is a games are easier because I've been playing them longer thing either. I went back and played the original Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter games this year, and they all gave me more trouble than this game. It really is just the developers deciding that the challenging platforming would be too much to handle for kids, and if that's the case, I personally feel like they're selling kids short. I grew up as a kid loving games based on the challenge of older platformers. The two most popular games with Gen Z are Fortnite and Minecraft, two games with a ton of depth and different mechanics to juggle. Each Souls game is a runaway success, and they've been going for 11 years now, which means the series has been taking on new fans that aren't all 24 to 35 years old. The indie scene is dominated by challenging games, and it's clear that today's gamers aren't attracted to games that are easy, but games that are polished and challenge them in a well-balanced way. I think kids can handle difficult games, you just have to be brave enough to give them a chance. But maybe I'm wrong, or maybe the developers or Sony thought that that would be too much of a risk, so they made the game easier. But it's just a shame. In this new game, even with the optional challenge areas, there really isn't any thinking or reflexes involved. If you're new to games or aren't that great at them, then Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is probably a vast sea of challenges that'll give you a really good time. But if you're like me, someone who's really good at games and thus really cool, it's still fun purely based off the smooth controls and visuals, but it's not a challenge, and that's what I found myself missing in this game. And honestly, depth and challenge is the thing that's probably the biggest problem, quote unquote, with this game. The ideas in the universe are cool, but they're lacking the satire that made the old game so memorable. The shooting and platforming is smoother than ever, but all the new ideas are barely explored. Honestly, a lot of these aren't really necessarily huge flaws in the game, assuming Insomniac is trying to make a casual game and didn't just fail to make a more complicated one, but rather hopes for a new game. There's a part of me that really hopes that Insomniac makes a new franchise made for teens or adults that takes the ideas they've stumbled upon in this game and really runs with them, making a game at the same level of creativity that takes these ideas to challenging new heights. For now though, Rift Apart is still a fun time and a worthwhile purchase. I'll be beating this game more than once, and I'll probably have fun doing it, but in the back of my mind I'll always be yearning for more. Maybe that's not fair, but it is what it is. I'm going to stop here to say, let me know what you think about this game in the comments, and let me know what you think about this video in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already. I know the sound quality in this video isn't particularly great. I'm trying to save up some more money so that I can pay down my credit card enough to justify purchasing some soundproofing so that I can soundproof the new room that I moved into. I know I said last video that I'd be releasing my video on video game refunds now, but that video is taking a very long time, and I wanted to put this video out while the game was as close to relevant as I can get, which I know is already weeks out, but whatever. Despite all of my complaining in this video, I had a really good time playing the game, so much so that wanting to play this game is the reason the video wasn't put out sooner. Like, I genuinely have just been playing this game a whole bunch. But I could have had an even better time, and I guess I'll just have to wait and hope for another game to scratch that itch.